My hands don't shake. They never have. Not when a 2-pound newborn, translucent as a poppy petal, was placed in my palms for the first time. Not when I had to thread a central line into a vein no wider than a thread in a toddler's neck. Not when I signed a dozen death certificates in a single, brutal night during a bad flu season. My hands were instruments of calm, of precision. They were a pediatric intensivist's greatest asset, and I honed them like a surgeon's scalpel. But right now, as I stare at this single sheet of paper on my kitchen table, they are trembling. A fine, uncontrollable vibration, as if my very bones are humming with a current of pure dread. The paper is from the county's Department of Child and Family Services. It states, in cold, bureaucratic language, that a preliminary investigation has been opened into the welfare of my son, Leo. The words medical neglect are circled. I have spent my entire adult life inside the sanctum of hospitals, a high priestess at the altar of saving children. I trusted the system, the protocols, the grand, intricate machine of healthcare and child protection. I was one of its most dedicated cogs. And now, that very same machine has turned its impersonal, grinding gears on my own child, and I realize, with a nausea that climbs from my gut to my throat, that I have never truly understood fear until this moment. I became a doctor because of a memory. I was 7, and my younger brother, Sam, had a ferocious asthma attack one night. I remember the blue of his lips in the frantic car ride, the way my mother's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The emergency room was a cacophony of beeps and shouted orders, a terrifying jungle of unknown sounds. Then, a woman in a white coat knelt in front of me. She wasn't looking at my parents, she was looking at me. Your job, she said, her voice impossibly calm, is to be brave for your brother. Can you do that? She had a stethoscope around her neck, its chest piece shaped like a cartoon character. She let me listen to my own heart, a steady thump-thump-thump that quieted the panic in my own chest. In that moment, the chaos had a focal point, and it was her. She wasn't just a doctor, she was a translator of terror, a maker of calm. I knew, with the absolute certainty of a child, that I wanted to be that for someone else. The path wasn't easy. Medical school was a marathon of exhaustion, a blur of textbooks thicker than bricks and cadavers that taught me more about mortality than any philosophy class ever could. Residency in pediatrics was its own special kind of hell, 36-hour shifts, the constant weight of life and death decisions on shoulders that still felt too young to bear them. I missed birthdays, holidays, funerals. I once fell asleep in a plate of spaghetti at a friend's wedding. My social life shriveled to nothing. But the work was a privilege that left me breathless with its gravity. I held the hands of parents as their world was falling apart. I explained complex congenital heart defects with drawings on a whiteboard, my pen giving shape to the invisible enemy inside their child's chest. I learned to deliver the worst news a parent can hear, and I learned to celebrate the smallest, most miraculous victories, the first unaided breath after weeks on a ventilator, the first smile after a round of chemotherapy. My wedding ring felt like a counterweight to the stethoscope. David, my husband, is an architect. He builds things meant to last centuries, to withstand storms and time. He understood my world of fragile, temporary bodies in a way no one else could. He was the one who would have a warm meal waiting for me at 2 a.m., who would listen to me cry with frustration after losing a patient, who would remind me that the world existed outside the hospital's sterile walls. When I told him I wanted to specialize in pediatric intensive care, the hardest of the hard, he didn't flinch. He just said, "Then that's what you'll do. And I'll be here." Our love was the solid ground I could always return to, the anchor that kept me from drifting into the abyss of my own empathy. Then came Leo. After years of focusing on my career, of believing my life's purpose was to heal other people's children, I was given my own. He was born on a rainy Tuesday morning, and the moment they placed him on my chest, all the textbook knowledge, all the clinical experience, evaporated. This wasn't a patient. This was a soul-deep rearrangement of my entire universe. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a thatch of dark hair, and a cry that sounded like a promise. I remember counting his breaths, just as I had for countless infants in the NICU, but this time it was different. This time, the fear was primal, personal, a constant, low-level hum in the background of my newfound joy. Being a mother made me a better doctor. The abstract concept of a parent's love became a tangible, overwhelming force in my life. And being a doctor, I thought, would make me a better mother. I knew about nutrition, developmental milestones, and the warning signs of serious illness. I was armed with knowledge. I thought it made me invincible. Leo was a happy baby, full of gummy smiles and a curiosity that knew no bounds. But as he grew into a toddler, David and I began to notice things. He was different. He didn't respond to his name with the consistent alertness of other children. He was deeply fascinated by spinning things, the wheels on his toy cars, the ceiling fan, to the exclusion of everything else. He had moments of intense, inconsolable frustration that seemed to come from nowhere, his small body overwhelmed by sensations we couldn't see or understand. The world, for Leo, seemed too bright, too loud, too much. My medical mind began to whir, sorting through differential diagnoses. But my mother's heart resisted, whispering denials. He's just a late bloomer. He's just strong-willed. He's perfect. The diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, when it finally came, was delivered by a gentle-faced developmental pediatrician named Dr. Evans. She sat in a room filled with toys, her voice soft as she used words like neurodivergent, sensory processing, and support needs. I heard her as both a doctor and a mother. The doctor in me nodded, understanding the clinical picture, the brain scans, the evidence-based therapies. The mother in me felt the floor drop away. It wasn't a tragedy. I knew that, intellectually. This was my son, and he was simply wired differently. The grief I felt wasn't for him, but for the world I thought he would inhabit, a world that was often cruel and unaccommodating to those who were different. I made a vow to myself that day, standing in the parking lot, holding Leo's small hand in my steady one. I would be his translator, his protector. I would use all my knowledge, all my privilege, to build a world for him that he could navigate. And for a while, we did. We became a team. David designed our home to be a sensory sanctuary, soft lighting, quiet corners, textures that soothed him. I used my medical contacts to get him into the best occupational and speech therapies. We learned his language. We learned that a meltdown in the grocery store wasn't a tantrum, but a neurological storm, a system overloaded by fluorescent lights and too many choices. We learned that his intense focus on the patterns of rain on a windowpane wasn't a deficit of attention, but a deep, beautiful engagement with the world most of us ignore. He was teaching us to see differently. My stethoscope, once a symbol of my life's work, now often hung on the back of a chair. My most important work was here, at home, helping my son navigate a world that wasn't built for him. The trouble started with school. We fought for an individualized education program, a legally binding document that would guarantee Leo the supports he needed. It was my first real taste of battle against an institution. I sat in meetings with school administrators, my medical degree and my carefully researched binders spread out before me, arguing for a full-time aide, for sensory breaks, for a curriculum adapted to his learning style. I was polite but firm, clinical but passionate. I spoke their language of benchmarks and outcomes. I won those battles, but I could feel the subtle resistance, the quiet resentment from some of the staff. I was the doctor mom, the one who thought she knew better. I didn't care. For Leo, I would be as difficult as I needed to be. The incident that triggered the unthinkable was, in hindsight, so small. Leo, then 8, had a particularly difficult day at school. A fire drill had sent his nervous system into a tailspin. He came home dysregulated, his engine running too high, as his therapist would say. He was jumping on the couch, making loud, repetitive noises, unable to calm down. David was away on a business trip. I tried all our usual tools, the weighted blanket, the noise-canceling headphones, the deep pressure. Nothing was working. In his frantic movement, he tripped and fell against the sharp corner of our coffee table. It was a clean, deep gash on his forehead, right at the hairline. It bled, as head wounds do, a dramatic amount. My doctor's instincts took over. I assessed the cut. It needed stitches. The bleeding was controlled with direct pressure. I cleaned it, applied a butterfly bandage, and knew a trip to the ER was necessary for proper closure. I was calm. This was a simple, mechanical problem. I bundled a still upset Leo into the car, talking to him in a low, soothing voice, explaining what would happen at the hospital. He was scared, the bright lights and strangers only adding to his sensory overload. When we got to the ER, the triage nurse saw a crying, agitated child with a fresh cut and a mother who seemed almost too calm. I explained his autism, his sensory sensitivities. I asked if we could wait in a quieter area. I asked if the doctor could use a topical anesthetic before the numbing injection, to lessen the pain. The ER was busy. They were short-staffed. The doctor who saw us was young, harried. He barely made eye contact. He dismissed my suggestions. "We have a standard protocol for sutures," he said, his voice clipped. When he came at Leo with the needle, Leo, already in a state of fight or flight, flailed and screamed. It took 2 nurses and myself to hold him still. It was awful. I was whispering in his ear, "I'm here, baby, I'm here. It's almost over," while my heart was being shredded. The doctor finished the stitches, made a note in the chart, and left without another word. I felt a flicker of professional anger. His bedside manner was atrocious. But I was too focused on calming my traumatized son to give it much more thought. We went home. I held Leo until he fell into an exhausted sleep, his small body finally still against mine. I thought the worst was over. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was formal, on official letterhead. It stated that a mandatory reporter at the hospital had filed a concern regarding Leo's injury and my demeanor during the visit. The words leapt off the page: suspicious injury, child in distress, parent appeared detached and unemotional. They were opening an investigation for possible medical neglect. The world tilted on its axis. I read the words again and again, but they refused to make sense. Detached? Unemotional? I was being a doctor for my son in that moment, because that was what he needed. My calm was a deliberate, professional tool I was using to navigate a crisis. They had mistaken my competence for coldness. They had pathologized my strength. The first caseworker visited the following week. Her name was Ms. Gable. She was a woman in her 50s with a tight bun and eyes that held no warmth. She walked through our home, her clipboard a weapon. She opened our refrigerator, noted the healthy food. She looked at Leo's perfectly safe, sensory-friendly room and called it sparse. She interviewed Leo alone in the living room while I waited in the kitchen, my stomach in knots. I could hear her asking him leading questions. "Does mommy ever get angry? Does she ever hit you?" Leo, confused by the stranger and the strange questions, began to stim, rocking back and forth and humming. I knew he was trying to self-regulate. I heard Ms. Gable's pen scratching across the paper, and I knew what she was seeing, a nervous child. I tried to explain. I showed her Leo's extensive medical files, his therapy reports, his IEP. I explained his autism, his sensory profile. I explained that my demeanor in the ER was a calculated response to keep my child from becoming more terrified. She listened, her expression unchanging. "We have to investigate all claims thoroughly, Dr. Vance," she said. "It's for the child's protection." The way she said Dr. Vance was not a title of respect, but an accusation. As if my profession was a shield I was hiding behind. I was being judged by a system I had once been a part of. I had sat on the other side of that table, in hospital conference rooms, when we had to make difficult calls to child services. I had always believed we were the good guys, the protectors. Now, I saw the terrifying power of a single, misguided report, the bureaucratic inertia that could crush a family without malice, without even true intent, just a blind adherence to procedure. The investigation became a dark cloud over our lives. David was furious, a quiet, simmering rage I had never seen in him before. He wanted to hire the most aggressive lawyer he could find and sue the hospital, the county, everyone. But I was paralyzed by a strange, professional shame. This was my world. These were my people. To fight them felt like a betrayal of everything I stood for. I kept thinking, if I could just explain it better, if I could just get them to understand, they would see this was all a terrible mistake. I requested a meeting with the head of the hospital's pediatrics department, a man I had worked with for years, Dr. Miller. I sat in his familiar office, surrounded by the framed diplomas and family photos that spoke of a life similar to my own. I laid it all out, my voice shaking for the first time. "Robert," I said, using his first name, "you know me. You know I would never neglect my child. This is a misunderstanding about my son's disability." He listened, his face a mask of professional sympathy. He steepled his fingers. "Elara," he said, "I do know you. And I believe you. But my hands are tied. The report was made in good faith. The system has to run its course. It's a formality, I'm sure. A formality. My son's well-being, my family's peace, was just a formality to him. The institution was closing ranks. I was no longer a colleague, I was a case file. That was the moment the last vestige of my professional identity shattered. The trust one had placed in the system, the machine I had served so faithfully, evaporated. It was a brittle, fragile thing, and it lay in pieces at my feet. They weren't going to help me. I was on my own. The fear that had been a hum now became a roar. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. The words foster care were never said, but they hung in the air, a specter in every interaction with Ms. Gable. The thought of anyone taking my son away from me, from his sanctuary, from the parents who understood his very soul, was a physical pain, a constant ache in my chest. I stopped being Dr. Vance, the calm, collected physician. I became Elara, the mother, a creature of pure, primal instinct. I hired a lawyer, but not the aggressive pit bull David wanted. I found a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who specialized in disability rights and family law. She was sharp, methodical, and she understood the landscape. "They're evaluating Leo by neurotypical standards," she said. "Your calm is seen as coldness. His stimming is seen as fear. We have to reframe the entire narrative." And so, we began to fight. We assembled a dream team of experts, Leo's developmental pediatrician, Dr. Evans, his occupational therapist, a child psychologist who specialized in autism. We didn't just defend against the accusation of neglect, we went on the offensive. We built a case that showed the county was, in fact, discriminating against a disabled child by misinterpreting his and his mother's behavior. The personal cost was immense. I took a leave of absence from the hospital. I couldn't stand to walk those halls, to see the posters about child safety, to sit in meetings where we discussed the system. I felt like a ghost in my own life. The stethoscope on my desk gathered dust. David and I, united in our love for Leo, found ourselves frayed by the constant stress. We snapped at each other over trivial things, the fear and helplessness manifesting as anger. We were living in a state of siege, and the enemy was a faceless bureaucracy that could not be reasoned with. Leo felt the tension. He became more withdrawn, more anxious. His sleep was disturbed. The sanctuary we had built for him had been violated, and he knew it. The guilt was a heavy stone in my stomach. My fight to protect him was, in itself, causing him harm. The climax of this nightmare was not in a dramatic courtroom, but in a small, beige conference room at the county building. It was the final review hearing. On one side of the table sat Ms. Gable and her supervisor. On our side sat Sarah, David, me, and our small battalion of experts. The air was thick with tension. Ms. Gable presented her report, her voice monotone. She cited the suspicious injury, the child's distress, my clinical detachment. She painted a picture of a cold, unfeeling doctor mother and a frightened, neglected boy. It was a caricature of our life, a horror story constructed from misunderstandings and checkboxes. Then, it was our turn. Sarah stood. She didn't address the allegations point by point. Instead, she began to tell a story. Our story. She talked about Leo. She had Dr. Evans explain autism not as a deficit, but as a different way of being. She had the OT explain what a meltdown truly is, a neurological event, not a behavioral problem. She had the child psychologist explain that a parent's calm, regulated presence is the single most important tool for de-escalating a child in sensory overload. She reframed my detachment as expert crisis management. She reframed Leo's distress as a predictable response to a traumatic medical environment for a child with his needs. Then, Sarah turned to me. Dr. Vance, would you like to speak? My hands were in my lap. I willed them to be still. I looked across the table at Ms. Gable and her supervisor. I thought of all the children I had saved, all the parents I had comforted. I thought of the oath I took to do no harm. And then I looked at David, who gave me a small, firm nod, and I thought of Leo waiting at home with his grandmother. I was not there as Dr. Vance. I was there as Leo's mother. I began to speak, my voice low but clear. I have dedicated my life to saving children, I said. I have held the hands of dying babies and fought with every ounce of my skill to keep them in this world. I have sat with parents in their darkest hours, and I have looked them in the eye and promised them I would do everything in my power to help their child. I believed in this system. I trusted it. It was my church, my calling. I paused, letting the words hang in the quiet room. But the system I trusted sees in black and white. It has checkboxes for good parent and bad parent. It has no checkbox for a mother who is also a doctor, using her skills to help her autistic son through a medical procedure. It has no checkbox for a child who communicates his fear through movement and sound, not words. You looked at my son and you saw a problem to be solved. I look at my son and I see a universe of wonder. You looked at my calm and you saw neglect. I was giving my son the anchor he needed in his storm. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply laid my truth bare before them. You are not protecting my son. You are traumatizing him. Your investigation, these visits, this constant threat, has taken the feeling of safety from his home. That is the real harm being done here. I am not asking you to understand me. I am demanding that you see my son for who he is. And I am telling you that I will never, ever stop fighting for him. Even if the enemy is the very institution I once called my home. There was a long silence when I finished. Ms. Gable would not meet my eyes. Her supervisor, an older man with a weary expression, slowly closed his file folder. He looked at the assembled experts, at the thick packet of reports and letters we had submitted. He looked back at me. The county, he said, his voice heavy, is dropping the investigation. The case is closed. There were no apologies. No admissions of error. Just the grinding of gears halting. It was over. We walked out of that building into the blinding afternoon sun. David gripped my hand, his own trembling now. We didn't speak. We just stood there, breathing the free air, the weight of the world finally lifting from our shoulders. We had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a survival. I never went back to the ICU. I couldn't. The sight of the hospital, the smell of antiseptic, the sound of the monitors, it all brought back the visceral terror of those months. The trust was broken. I had seen the machine from the inside, and I knew its flaws, its cold, unfeeling heart. I had been a part of it, and I had almost been destroyed by it. My legacy is no longer measured in the children I saved in a hospital, though I am proud of every single one. My legacy is my son. Leo is 12 now. He still sees the world in his own beautiful, unique way. He has a prodigious talent for drawing intricate, detailed sketches of buildings and machines that astonish his father. He is happy. The shadow of the investigation has finally faded from his eyes. The sanctuary of our home has been restored. And I have found a new purpose. I started a nonprofit advocacy group for parents of children with disabilities who are facing similar battles with the system. I use my medical knowledge and my hard-won experience to be their translator, their guide, their protector. I sit with them in IEP meetings. I help them navigate the labyrinth of social services. I teach them how to document everything, how to speak the language of bureaucracies, how to find their own voice. I am still a doctor, I suppose. But now my patient is the family unit itself, and my mission is to inoculate them against the very system that is supposed to help them. The stethoscope I used to wear is in a box in the attic. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, I take it out. I hold the cold, familiar metal in my hands, and I remember the doctor I was. I remember the lives I held in these hands. They were good hands. They were steady hands. They are still steady, though their work has changed. They are now hands that build, that advocate, that hold my son and my husband, that write letters and hold the hands of other frightened parents. The system is a flawed, human thing, capable of great good and terrible, impersonal harm. I learned that the hard way. But I also learned that the love of a mother is a force that can stare down any system, any institution, any fear. It is the one diagnosis that has no cure, and the only medicine that never fails. My hands don't shake anymore. They are too busy holding on to what matters.